Hi, everybody. So I'm here with John Alexander. We're exploring some problem definitions for issues and thorns and challenges in the space of assemblies, popular assemblies, people's assemblies, citizens' assemblies. And this question that I'm trying to define is about having a bigger plan. So what is the bigger plan? And on my conversations with a lot of experts, including some notes that I've got here from our friend Graham Smith, the reflection is that lots of assemblies, almost all of them, happen without a bigger plan, as in no follow-up strategy. And in Graham's words, this is a disaster. So to help me work out what the question should be, what have you got to say about that, John?
A lot, always. So the question for me, like you say, what's the bigger plan? Kind of what happens next? Like, it's however well you do an assembly, however sort of formally structured it is, there's relatively few examples of the stuff actually happening as a result. So you can look, for example, at the French Citizens Convention on Climate, where you had a really thorough, rigorous process. You even had the president of France saying at the outset of the process that the recommendations would get written into law, and then actually almost none of those recommendations actually coming into force. They're sort of dribs and drabs now, long after. So even when you have that really powerful state mandate, or at least from part of the state, there are examples of it not actually coming through to stuff happening, which arguably at the end of the day is the point, right? Stuff happening. And where I think a lot of the discussion has been today, I think is in slightly the wrong, I would argue slightly the wrong place. Like, it tends to make us think, okay, how do we make the state mandate, the commissioning mandate, even better? Because for these things to really happen, therefore, they have to be commissioned by the state, and they have to have a legally binding mandate, and that has to be very carefully defined and so on. And I understand the logic of that. And I also think there's a couple of problems with it. I think one is that if you have that kind of, if we aim for the strongest possible mandate, then arguably you're kind of creating incentives, which mean that the question that's asked is likely to get smaller. That's just the nature of things. If we're looking for legally binding, then in this kind of space of uncertainty, it makes them likely to control that uncertainty. There's also the problem that, like, if we focus entirely on the state, then what you're really doing is whatever mandate you get, you're focusing all of the attention on what power the state has, what the recommendation should be for the state to act. And that actually fulfills kind of almost the opposite purpose of what citizen democracy, participatory democracy is about, where it again sort of locates all power in the state rather than in the people, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, like, I think there's a different way of thinking about this that is more about, like, how can we plan and create culture and create moments that make the process and therefore the outputs of an assembly unignorable. And so, and like what we tried to do, for example, I mean, so take an example that arguably of assembly process working at its very best, the Irish referendum on abortion in 2018, the Citizens' Assembly that went before that from 2016, was conducted entirely in the public eye. It was a very powerful issue, and when the recommendation to legalize access to abortion up to 12 weeks came out of the assembly, there was huge public awareness of that. And so when the referendum was put together, the terms of the referendum were put together, they couldn't not put that recommendation forward into the referendum. Now, by contrast, relatively recently, Ireland's had some problems with their assembly and referendum mechanism, because the recommendations that came out of an assembly on care, for example, were not in the public eye as much, arguably, and so the wording actually got changed by government between the assembly and the referendum, and it's caused all sorts of kerfuffle and disagreement and blame on the assembly and blame. So, but the point being, if in the first instance in the abortion referendum you had that really clear public eye, you had the awareness, and that couldn't not go through. So for me, the question then is, how do we like I say, how do we make the recommendations? How do we make the process? How do we make the outputs unignorable? And this is what in the experiment we've tried, I've been involved in the process of the People's Plan for Nature. The original intention was that David Attenborough would launch the outputs of the People's Plan for Nature on the day of the first episode of the Wild Isles documentary series, which was sort of Attenborough's kind of British nature series. And that would sort of conduct the public eye onto it and make it a moment. For various reasons that we won't go into, that didn't happen. And I think it undercut the impact of the whole process. But for me, that's the right exam question. How do we make and public attention is one answer, but the question is, how do we make these processes unignorable? How do we do them in a way that actually builds the attention, so that those in positions of power and influence can't ignore their outputs? And that doesn't have to be a hard legal structure. It can be what you might call a softer approach.
Yeah, it can be a cultural strategy, can be PR, publicity, can be endorsement.
Can be grassroots movement building, right? Like that might be a better way of thinking about the relationship between what you might call people's assemblies or pop assemblies or community assemblies and a sortition-based citizen assembly. You might have so many of these discussions going on around a country that then when a formal assembly takes place, that people feel they have a stake in that. One idea we played with and again couldn't quite make happen, but was to have the People's Assembly for Nature, the actual sortition-based citizens assembly, have its first 3 meetings, then produce draft recommendations, put them out to the public and seed community assemblies to discuss those recommendations, and then have a 4th meeting of the assembly to confirm which would be enacted upon and finalize, which would then potentially have had all the people who'd been in those community conversations as advocates and feeling ownership of it and ready to hold the politicians and the businesses and so forth to account for acting on them. So that's another way of doing it.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Well, I will soon convene a conversation about precisely this, John. I'll invite you back to it, and including more people who've been thinking about this problem. Thanks very much. See you soon.